Hey everybody, Stephen Joy here. This is just another video in my take on different books that I read and how I could use them in RPG games. I feel like I have to give a warning here, just because there seem to be people that can't handle different opinions from their own. So yeah, this I'm going to do a review of this book, The Maids, and this does contain some of my opinions. Those opinions may be different than yours. It does have sort of grown-up content. So if none of that sounds good to you, if you can't handle that, then please don't watch this video, because you're probably not going to enjoy it, and I'm not going to listen to you complaining. So yeah, just a quick disclaimer there. So anyway, this book is called The Maids. I'm going to butcher the names here. I'm not very good with Japanese names, but I'll give it my best shot here. It's by Junichiro Tanizaki. Now, I know I butchered that. And it's translated by Michael P Cronin. So I'm going to go over a quick review of this book, some of the stuff I learned in it, some of the things that I found that were interesting, and then I'm going to cover how I would treat this as a game aid. I know that's a little unusual, but I've found a great way to add content to a game, to add new elements to a game, that sort of thing. So I'll just begin. I don't have much to show, you know, in the way of images and stuff. So it's basically a talking hands video. But this is the book. It's a hardcover book, and I found it extremely interesting. So it starts around 1937, before the Great East Asian War, which I think is how the Japanese call the Second World War, at least their involvement in it. And it follows the journey of a family and their maids, and focuses on the maids primarily. So there are all kinds of different characters in this book, and they work for a household that is run by Reichi, who is the husband, and Sanko, who is his wife, and they own the house. They're fairly well to do, and this follows the story of the different maids. I believe it's written in the son's voice, although I may have missed when that was specified. You know, I sometimes read these books when I'm very tired, so I miss things sometimes. But anyway, I assume that's whose voice it's written in, but I'm not 100% sure. One of the main characters in it is a maid called Hatsu, but there's a whole bunch of different maids. So this is, like I say, set in 1937, and it's in Japan, so it's very culturally different. It's translated from the Japanese. So some of the stuff that I found really interesting about it was that Reichi seems to objectify the maids a lot, and it seems to be sort of normalized. He focuses very heavily on their physical characteristics, as though that has something to do with their character, and he bases, not always, but a lot, on whether he likes the maids or not, on their physical characteristics. Found that kind of interesting. Not something that would be very tolerated these days, at least here. I don't know what it's like in Japan. There is rape in this book by page 12 already, and that's, you know, pretty rough. Especially, I believe, if memory serves, it's by an indentured maid. So I think that's kind of interesting from a perspective of that I didn't realize that Japan still had slavery before the Second World War, and I believe even after the war they had slavery. So that's rough. That's new to me. I didn't know that. So another aspect of this that I found interesting that I could use in a campaign world is the idea of local accents. So having a region of the world that where people have where you can tell where people are from by their accents. So they have different accents depending on where they're from. I think that would be fascinating, especially if you think about for thieves. They would have to spend a lot of time concentrating on hiding their accents if they wanted to fool people that they were from a different place or something like that. I'm not sure how that would be implemented, but I think it would be interesting. It could just be covered under disguises, but I think that it would be acceptable to expect the thief to have to practice the accent at least, or hiding their accent at least for a while. So yeah, the character Hatsu's sister is the one that was indentured. And it says that she agreed to be indentured, but I mean, you can agree to be slavery. And indentured, what indentured meant, I don't know exactly what it means in Japan. Japan, I'm not sure if it's a absolute correct translation, you know. But what it means basically is that you've written a contract between yourself and someone else, and you've agreed to receive a sum of money in exchange for a duration of service. And it's called indentured because what the person paying the money would do is tear the paper, and then they would give one half of the paper to the indentured servant, and the other would keep the piece of paper, and then you could match the pieces of paper together to verify that it's the correct contract. So that it's pretty brutal. At least in the North America and in Europe, where indentured servitude was allowed. Not, you weren't expected to live very long, especially if you were indentured and you came over to North America. It wasn't a race thing. Anybody could be indentured. And I can't remember exactly, but it was very, very few. I think like 80% of indentured people didn't actually make it through their contracts. They usually died before the end of it. So it was brutal. I don't know what the rate, how it worked exactly in Japan. But they had it. It's indentured. It is slavery, so it's pretty brutal. And I remember, I did a review of another book wherein I said that I would not include slavery in one of my games, and I need to revisit that. I've discovered that there's a lot of misinformation and so forth about slavery, and this, particularly the history of slavery and the different kinds of slavery and that kind of thing. So I think if I were playing with friends, not acquaintances, not people I met on the internet, not people, that I didn't have a good relationship with, but if I were playing with actual friends, then I would have slavery in my game. I would, because it's something that I would find interesting to understand. And it was an actual part of history. It's an actual part of the world's, every country across time has had slavery at some point. So I think that it's unrealistic to have a fantasy world or a campaign world without some form of slavery in it. Now, it could be up to the heroes to fight against it. Maybe they could crusade against it. Maybe they just participate. I have no idea. But it is miserable. It is horrible. I fully acknowledge that. But it's also likely, Well, it's endemic to almost every society that I know of. At some point, they had it. I think before the Industrial Revolution, the wealthy and the elites couldn't have the luxuries that they wanted without slavery. I think at the end of the day, that's what it boils down to. I think without machines and without computers and without robots and that sort of thing. But even before all of that, without milling machines and looms and that sort of thing, then serfdom, indentured slavery, slavery itself was really required by the elites to have the lifestyle that they wanted. And I think at the heart of it, that's the thing. But I'm not sure. And like I say, I use campaign worlds to try and understand the world around me. And so if I were playing with friends, like I say, not acquaintances, not, people I met online, but actual people that are interested in discovering sort of reality with me, the world with me through the means of role-playing games, I entrusted me as a GM enough to allow me to explore topics, and I trusted them as players enough to explore the topics, which is why I say they would have to be actual friends. Then yes, I would include it in my game. So I'm just going to leave that here right now. Anyway, so going on. So the maids in this book, they're pretty young. Like, they leave their homes pretty young. I think around 14, 15. They're considered adults at that stage. They, which was a thing. It's fairly new, this idea that you're still a kid when you're 25. I don't know. Even when I was a teenager, I mean, my parents considered me grown and an adult when I was 15. I don't know. Now everybody says you have to be 18 or 19, something like that. So the world's changing, but it didn't used to be like that. And in fact, I know in the Middle Ages, an 8-year-old was considered an adult. So the age has been slowly moving up. But anyway, so what happens is that families would send their daughters to households, and they would work as maids in the households, and they were expected to find husbands while they were doing it. Now, in this novel, Raichi and Sanko, who are they it's their house that all these maids live in, they are interested in the welfare of the maids and helping them find wives and stuff like that. And they seem like pretty nice people. I don't know if all the households were like that at the time. I would have to read some history books about Japan at that time before I actually ran a campaign world, like this. Or I would run a world, sort of a fantasy world, so that it wasn't exactly Japan, and then it would give me more leeway with this. But yeah, the Sanko and Raichi seemed, fairly nice to me. Except Raichi, he would yell and call names to the maids, but I don't think he exploited them, or in a sexual way or anything. Although he did seem to have a lot of interest in how they looked. And like I said, the rape on page 12, that was of a maid by someone in a household, and she fled from it. So she was able to get out of that bad situation. Another interesting thing that I ran into was that there's a thing called night crawling, and that was where men would sort of sneak in and visit unmarried women living with their parents still. I thought that was kind of fun. Night crawling, I would definitely add that to a campaign. Maybe a city or maybe a region of the world where night crawling was a common practice. I think there could be a lot of fun with that. And you could have a lot of shenanigans start over that. Now the people that ran these households, that had these young women come and stay with them, it seemed like they were acting in a somewhat parental way to them. They would give them bonuses and look after their welfare. They would take them out on outings and that kind of thing, and they seemed to be quite fond of them. Now, I don't know if that's just this household, if all households were like that, if that was traditional. I have no idea, but in this book, that's the way it was. Another thing I found really interesting was the maids were all given nicknames, especially in the early years. Later on, they started using the maids' actual names, but in the early days, because this book is sort of an odyssey, it's a temporal odyssey, right? And so it just starts at 1937, but ends up way further on than that. And so they would give the maids nicknames, and then later on that was kind of considered rude. But in the beginning it wasn't. And I thought that was kind of neat. Like, that's a thing that I would be inclined to also add to a campaign world. And then another aspect of it that I thought was fascinating too is that they seem to consider disease as they thought that flaws in a person's character could cause disease. I found that absolutely fascinating. I think that would be a great thing to add. Could you imagine going to a doctor and say, well, you probably have bronchitis because you're greedy? I think that would be absolutely fascinating. I think that in a campaign world, that could be really built on for all kinds of things. A person could even have maybe magic spells to help curb one's character, or you could have devices or people that help change your character so that you could get over a disease. Of course, it wouldn't work, but I mean, there's no reason a campaign world has to be factual with what we know today, right? So another aspect I found really interesting, and I guess this maybe is Japanese culture. I don't know if it's still like that anyway, but at the time of the writing, it certainly was, and that was that basically you had to do what older people told you to do, even if they were only like a few months older than you. You were still obliged to listen to them. I found that absolutely fascinating. And what's more, I find it fascinating that someone, as a father myself, I couldn't imagine if my daughter had to listen to and do whatever anybody older said. I couldn't imagine sending her to some strange household to work as a maid. Forget it. But anyway, it was the way it was done, and I suppose they didn't. I don't know. It's fascinating. I would love to know how that works. Another interesting thing I found in this book was that it was supposed that marriage was a cure for disease as well. So there's one maid in this book that has epilepsy, and so she needs to get married so that she can cure epilepsy. And I think it does actually cure her epilepsy in the book, if I remember. I read this. I finished reading this book some months ago, so some of the facts I might have a little wrong, but I think it actually supposedly did cure her leprosy, which I thought was kind of humorous. So another aspect of this book that I found another thing I found interesting in here was it made me realize, maybe I'm just slow, I don't know, but it made me realize, that when you catch a whole school of fish, I don't know why I didn't ever equate this before, but if you catch a whole school of fish, so fishing boats have these huge drag nets that can be often kilometers long, right? And they just strip mine the oceans. And if you capture a whole school of fish, that's equivalent to catching a whole flock of birds. I found that very fascinating. I mean, if you catch a whole flock of birds, that flock is gone. That's the end of it. And it's never coming back. And, it might explain why our oceans are in so much trouble. Because if they're doing this and just wiping out entire schools like that. Anyway, I don't know. That's something I never associated the two, right? Because the ocean's a little hard to understand. You look and you just see the water on top. You don't really understand it in terms of the world that you interact with on a daily basis. But I can understand flocks of birds. And yeah, if you had an airplane flying through the sky and it just scooped up big flocks of geese, you wouldn't have geese for very long. You know, and I think that might be one of the reasons we're running out of fish. But yeah, I found that interesting. There's a big lesbian scandal in here, which is fascinating to see how in like the 40s they dealt with that. Obviously, it wasn't good. Everybody, well, I won't give you any spoilers, but it's interesting. I don't know how I would use that in a game. I don't think I would, because it's not very interesting to me. But it was interesting in the book how they reacted to it and stuff. Definitely my favorite maid character in the book was Coma. I enjoyed her character the most. One thing I thought was really cute was she was disgusted by French toast, which I just can't imagine being disgusted by French toast. I thought that was great. So, you know. And another thing that I found interesting was that when the maids wanted to get married, they had to get approval from their grandparents. So I find that fascinating. Can you imagine having to go to your grandparents to get approval? I just can't even imagine that. But that is something that could be used in a campaign world too. It would be fascinating. Sort of part of the culture is that in order to get married, you have to get blessed by the grandparents. I'm not sure what the consequences are of not getting blessed by the grandparents. I imagine it's, you know, you're not probably going to be part of the family for very long if you ignore it or something like that. It didn't really go into that. So, an interesting thing I found in this book, and it didn't really explain it, and I don't really understand, and I'm sure this is a cultural thing, but maids or young girls were sent into service to work at households in the hopes that they would find husbands and so forth. Whereas Hatsu's sister, who was indentured, she was sold into service. So there's must be some kind of distinction there, sent into service versus sold into service. I think if you're sold into service, it means you can't leave. You have to stay there for your term. Whereas sent into service means that you could leave if something there you don't like happens. You know, I think that's probably the difference. The other thing about this is that the characters, like the maids, are really, really delightful and charming. This whole book is delightful. It's so well translated, so well written. I just love it. It was an absolute delight to read. One of the things that I found entertaining, and maybe it's just because I'm playing the game right now, was that the characters reminded me a lot of RimWorld, especially on page 128. There's a section there. It just so much reminded me of RimWorld. And one of the things I love about the game RimWorld is how the characters have such characters, you know, such character. They have temper tantrums. You have to keep track of their psychology and stuff. This is a little bit like that, you know, having all these young women in your house. You would have to keep track of a lot of that stuff, just like you have to in RimWorld. And I thought that was really cute. And it seems like Sanko and Reichi saw themselves sort of as matchmakers, so they were trying to help the maids find husbands, and it was considered that, you know, they considered themselves successful if they managed to find a husband for a maid. I thought that was fascinating. I don't know if that's all households, but certainly this one in the book was like that. So that I found interesting too. And they would take the maids on outings. I found that interesting as well. They treated them almost like their own children, like stepchildren almost, and they cared a lot for them. I thought that was neat. So yeah, there's a lot in this book. A lot. I really highly, if you like reading, if you like fiction, if you like cute stories, you know, charming stories. But they do get dark and stuff in places. You know, it gets, you know, there's rape in it, there's different affairs in it and stuff like that. But it's all really interesting. I really love this book. So, how would I use this in a campaign world? Well, I think the game itself would make an absolute awesome setting. I think it would be fun to roll up characters, to choose some sort of a system, and roll up characters without an emphasis on combat. The characters probably wouldn't have any sort of combat, but they would be, you would have a game group and they all work in a household. And then you could have a series of events and they just sort of react to them. And you could have the owners of the household, and they, you know, and make them up as NPCs and how they behave, and then the players themselves live in this household as young women, and they would have adventures. They could have adventures of all sorts. You could even have random tables or whatever to have, you know, sort of what happens. They could have an encounter with a thief. One of the players could be accused of being a thief when in actuality it's somebody else. You could have murder mysteries to solve, that kind of thing, and property crimes to solve. You could have you know, different rivalries between different houses with the different maids. You know, you could have shenanigans going on with the different boys and so forth. And then you could also have, you know, other elements too. You could have supernatural elements or even combat elements if you wanted. I mean, it's just whatever you wanted, and you know, you could add strange events to it. So basically, you would have like a castle or a giant house. Everybody would roll up characters. They would be maids in that house. And then, you know, what happens if a ghost arrives? What happens if goblins show up, right? Or you could even make it more modern than that. You could actually keep it in like the 30s or 40s or something. That isn't something I'd be up to without a whole lot more reading. But certainly you could have them as being, you know, maids in a castle or something like that if you were, say, going to use D&D, something like that. I think a system like Fate might be really good for this. I'm not sure what system I would use for it. I think probably Fate, something like that. Anyway, something along those lines. Oh, even actually, I think the Apocalypse system might be really good for it, actually. Yeah. I think it would be very easy to change that system over to something like this, where you could have a world like this. So anyway, that's my take on the Maids. Great book. Highly recommend it. Very well written, very easy read. The writing has a wonderful smooth flow to it. The characters are very charming. I very much fell in love with this book. Highly recommend. I think it's a great source book for either as a setting or just for information. You can, you know, take little tidbits of it and put it into your own campaign world. Yeah. All right. Well, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this, please don't forget to subscribe and leave a like or leave a rumble if you're watching this on Rumble. And thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.